Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into the moment Truong tries to calm Tieu by cooking for her and Du, until a mysterious knock at the door brings a package with no name, and the fear they tried to hide comes rushing back. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next video. The morning after Truong's mother left, the house felt too quiet. The drizzle was gone, but the air stayed damp and cold. Everything looked the same: the small table, bowls drying by the window, Du's toys scattered in the corner. Yet Tieu felt like the walls had moved a little closer. She hadn't slept much. All night she lay on her side with one hand on her belly, listening to Truong breathe. He slept like someone trained to rest quickly, ready to wake if anything shifted. And every time he exhaled, her mind answered with the same line. She didn't know names, she didn't want names, but the idea alone was enough to turn peace into something fragile. At dawn, she finally sat up, slow and careful. Truong stirred immediately. "You okay?" he mumbled. "I'm fine," she whispered. "Just washing my face." His eyes opened halfway, searching her expression. He reached out and brushed her wrist. "If you get up, wake me." In the kitchen, she poured warm water, rinsed her mouth, and caught her reflection in a hanging metal pot. She tried to steady herself with small truths: morning, home, safe, but her thoughts slid anyway. Her gaze went to the front door, then the window, then the lock. Locked. Still, she checked again, then the back door, then the window bolt. Du stood in the doorway, hair messy, eyes half closed. "Mama?" The sight of him softened her instantly. The fear didn't disappear, but it loosened. "Come here," she said. Du toddled over and leaned into her. Warm and heavy in the sweet way children are when they trust you completely, she hugged him a little too tight, then forced herself to relax. Du looked up with a serious little frown. "Mama sad?" "No, baby. Mama's okay." He studied her, then patted her cheek carefully. Mama smile. A shaky laugh escaped her. "Okay," Mama smile. Satisfied, Du wandered to the table, already thinking about breakfast like the world was simple and kind. Tieu watched him and felt the worry twist again, not for herself, but for Truong and for Du. She didn't want Truong carrying everything alone. She knew he was trying to keep the past outside their door, but now she couldn't unknow what she'd heard. Her mind ran ahead. What if someone comes? What if they're watching? What if Truong gets hurt again? She shook her head as if she could shake the thoughts off. She started preparing breakfast out of habit, but her hands were clumsy. A bowl slipped. She caught it, but her heart jumped. She stood still, palm pressing lightly to her belly. "Easy," she whispered. Behind her, a quiet voice filled the doorway. "Hey." She turned. Truong stood there, hair still messy, eyes fully awake. He didn't say it, but she could tell he'd seen everything. "Sit." "I'm fine," she replied automatically. Truong shook his head once, calm but firm. "You're not fine. And it's okay." He pulled out a chair and guided her down with careful hands. The kindness made her throat tighten, like she'd been holding her breath since last night. Truong crouched in front of her, so their eyes were level. He tapped 2 fingers lightly against his temple. "What's going on in here?" he asked softly. Tieu tried to laugh. It didn't work. "I'm thinking too much." "About what Mum said," he replied. Not as an accusation, just a fact. Tieu's eyes stung. "I didn't want to tell you I'm scared." Truong's expression softened. He took both her hands. "She did. I'm here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." "I know," she whispered, voice trembling. "But you wanted peace. A simple life. And now we have to watch our backs." I don't want you carrying it alone. I don't want you to get hurt again. Truong's jaw tightened for a heartbeat, then he let it go. He stayed gentle. You don't have to carry it, he said. Not for me. He paused, as if choosing the right move. Then today, we do something else. Tieu blinked. What do you mean? Truong stood and rolled his sleeves. Today, your job is to sit and breathe. My job is to cook. Tieu stared. You? Yes, he said, and his mouth twitched like he knew how impossible that sounded. Du popped up like he'd heard fireworks. Papa, cook! Truong smiled. Yes, chef, Du gasped dramatically. Tieu couldn't stop the real smile that escaped. Truong noticed it immediately. He pointed gently at her. No lifting, no standing too long, no worrying. She opened her mouth to protest, but his look was soft and unmovable. Please, he said. That one word hit her harder than any lecture. Truong didn't ask often. When he did, it meant he needed her to trust him. Tieu nodded. Okay. Truong turned to the kitchen. He opened the cabinet, stared at ingredients, then looked back at Du. You're my assistant, he announced. Du puffed his chest. Yes. Truong slid a small bowl toward him. Count the eggs. Du leaned in, serious. 1, 2, 3. Truong nodded, then started washing vegetables. Water ran, steady and calming, and the simple sound eased something in Tieu's chest. She watched him move careful hands, focused eyes, quick glances toward Du. Don't touch the knife, Truong reminded. Dewey lifted both hands. No touch. Good, Truong said. Truong chopped garlic, sniffed, and made a face like the garlic had insulted him. You're arguing with it, she teased. Truong nodded solemnly. Dangerous? Very, Truong whispered. It makes Mama smile. Du squealed and clapped. Steam rose from the pot, filling the kitchen with a comforting smell. Truong stirred and told a story about burning rice and eating it anyway, out of pride. Du laughed. Tieu wrapped her hands around a cup and felt her thoughts slow down. They weren't sprinting anymore, they were walking. Truong glanced back, eyes gentle. Better? Tieu met his gaze. Words didn't come, so she just nodded, and Truong's shoulders eased, like he'd been holding his own breath too. The kitchen grew warmer as the pot simmered, and for a while, the only danger in the room was Truong's stubborn confidence. He tasted the soup, frowned, then added a pinch of salt, like he was negotiating with fate. Du stood on a small stool beside the table, watching with wide eyes. Papa, is it yummy? Truong glanced at him seriously. A chef never promises. A chef proves. Dewey gasped, like that was the coolest thing he'd ever heard. Proves? Tieu couldn't help smiling. The sound of Truong's voice, steady, playful, pulled her mind back from the edge. He wasn't pretending nothing happened. He was simply giving her a place to rest. But worry didn't vanish just because soup smelled good. It waited, quietly, patiently. When Truong turned off the stove and started plating the food, Tieu stood to help without thinking. Truong caught it instantly. Hey. She froze. Truong didn't scold her. He just stepped closer and gently guided her back into the chair, like she was something precious. Sit, he said, softer now. Let me. Tieu sighed, half annoyed with herself. I just wanted to. I know, Truong said. He placed a bowl in front of her. Your job is to eat. Du slapped his tiny hands on the table. My job too. Duh. Truong nodded. Especially you. The meal wasn't fancy, but it felt like a holiday. A warm bowl of soup. Rice that was cooked properly miraculously. No burnt bottom this time. A simple plate of vegetables and egg. The kind of food that didn't try to impress anyone. It just tried to comfort. Truong sat across from Tieu, watching her take the first bite like he was waiting for proof that she was okay. Tieu chewed slowly. The warmth spread through her chest, down into her stomach, easing the tightness she'd been carrying since last night. "It's good," she said quietly. Truong's eyes softened, and the corners of his mouth lifted with visible relief. "Good," he replied, as if the soup had just passed an important test. Dewey took a bite, then nodded like a strict food critic. "Papa cook, very good." Truong pretended to look proud. "Thank you, sir." For a few minutes, the house returned to normal. Dewey talked about the oranges and pomelos. Tieu asked him which one tasted sweeter. Truong listened, occasionally adding a small comment, but mostly he just watched them with an expression that said. Then, as if the quiet gave her courage, Tieu's voice lowered. Truong looked up immediately. "Last night, after your mom left, I couldn't stop thinking." Truong didn't interrupt. He waited. Tieu's fingers tightened around her spoon. "I kept imagining someone standing outside the gate, or someone watching from the road, and I hated myself for thinking like that, because I know you already have enough on your shoulders." "It's not your fault." Tieu finally looked up, and her eyes were shiny. "I'm not scared for me," she whispered. "I'm scared for you. For Du. For..." Her hand drifted to her belly, instinctive and protective. Truong's gaze followed her hand, and something deep in his face changed, like the words reached a place in him he didn't show often. He set his chopsticks down slowly. "Tieu," he said gently. She shook her head as if she couldn't stop once she started. "I saw you last night. You acted normal. You smiled. You didn't want to bring it into the house. But I know you. You were holding it in." Truong swallowed. Tieu's voice trembled. "I don't want to be another thing you have to protect alone. I want to help, but I don't know how. And that makes me feel useless." That word useless hit Truong hard. He leaned forward slightly, eyes steady. "You're not useless," he said firmly. "Listen to me. You're the reason I can breathe." Tieu blinked, caught off guard. Truong's voice stayed low, warm, and sure. "When I'm with you, my head gets quiet. When I hear Du laugh, I remember what I'm fighting for. You think that's nothing?" Tieu's throat tightened, and she tried to look away, but Truong reached across the table and gently held her hand. "You helping doesn't mean you need to carry the fear," he said. "You rest. You tell me when you're scared instead of swallowing it." Tieu's lips parted, and tears finally slipped down, silent and fast. She didn't sob. She just cried the way someone cries when they've been trying to be strong for too long. Tieu noticed immediately. He paused mid-bite, eyes widening. "No, baby, Mama's okay." Du looked worried, then climbed down from his chair and waddled over, placing his sticky hands on her arm. "Mama, no cry," he said, voice serious. "Papa, cook. Mama happy." Truong's chest tightened. He lifted his son gently and sat in between them. "You're right," Truong told Du softly. "Mama will be happy." Du nodded, satisfied, then rested his head against Truong's shoulder like he'd solved the problem. Tieu let out a shaky laugh through tears. "He thinks food fixes everything." Truong's mouth curved. "Sometimes it does." Tieu took a breath, calming. The room felt warmer, not because the soup was hot, but because the fear had finally been spoken out loud instead of hiding in corners. Truong squeezed her hand. "We'll be careful," he said. "We'll listen to Mum. We'll do what we need to do, but we're not going to let fear run this house." Tieu nodded slowly. "Promise?" Truong didn't answer with big words. He He simply reached up and brushed her hair back gently. The way you soothe someone without making them feel weak. I promise to stay, he said. That's my promise. Tieu lifted his head. Papa, stay. Truong smiled at him. Always. The rest of the meal went quieter. Not tense, just softer, like the house itself was exhaling. After they finished, Truong cleaned up without letting Tieu stand too much. Tieu helped by handing Truong spoons and then forgetting what he was doing halfway through. Tieu sat at the table, watching them, feeling her heart beat slow for the first time since yesterday. For a while, it worked. Her mind felt lighter until the smallest thing happened. A knock. Not loud, not aggressive, just 2 taps at the front door. Tieu's entire body stiffened. Truong froze too, but his face stayed calm, controlled. He glanced at Tieu first, not the door, as if to say. Truong put a finger to his lips. Shh, stay here. He moved toward the door with quiet steps, not rushing, not panicking. When he reached the door, he didn't open it immediately. He listened. Another soft tap. Truong turned the latch slightly, just enough to see through the crack, keeping his body between the opening and the room behind him. Delivery, the man said casually. For Truong? Truong's eyes narrowed slightly. Who sent it? The man shrugged. No name, just an address. Tieu's heart pounded so loudly, she felt it in her throat. She held her belly instinctively, trying to breathe. Truong didn't show fear. He didn't show anger. He showed nothing. Leave it by the gate, he said calmly. I'll get it. The man hesitated. It's already here. Gate. Truong repeated, voice low and firm. The man's eyes flicked past Truong's shoulder, like he was trying to see inside. Truong shifted, blocking the view completely. Finally, the man nodded. Okay. Truong watched him walk away. He waited until the footsteps were far enough, then closed the door gently, locked it, and turned back. Tieu's face was pale. What was that? Truong's expression stayed steady, but his eyes had changed sharper now. I don't know yet, he said. Tieu whispered. Papa. Scary? Truong immediately softened and crouched to Dewey's height. He touched his son's cheek gently. Not scary, he said. You did nothing wrong, he told her, and you're not alone. Tieu nodded, trying to be brave, but her eyes were glossy again. Truong took a slow breath, forcing calm into his body like a skill. Then he walked toward the back window to look out toward the gate. Outside, the damp road glistened. The package sat near the gate like a quiet threat, small, harmless looking, but heavy with meaning. Truong's jaw tightened. Behind him, the house was still warm. Tieu was still there. Tieu was still there, and Truong realized something with perfect clarity. Peace wasn't something you found. It was something you protected.